Well, I think what we're expecting to hear from Sir Keir Starmer today is announcement of the UK's enhanced emissions reduction target for 2035. So, what we would expect the impact of that to be is that this is a leading edge commitment by a major economy. The more countries that come out early and give these pledges, the more other countries will feel emboldened to come along. Not least because the faster some of the big economies are going, the more the economic opportunities grow, and the more, if you're slipping behind, you risk missing out. So, with all being well, that will be the announcement that we'll hear at his press conference. That will set the tone for the next couple of weeks in terms of the ambition that delegates here need to see from all countries, and the tone beyond, as the momentum towards the clean energy transition grows across the world.
Should we talk about the elephant that's left the room, or is likely to
Yeah.
leave the room?
Would the elephant have orange hair?
Blonde? Strawberry blonde, perhaps?
I'm sure that's what he'd describe us as, yes.
Let's talk about the United States, shall we? And in terms of what the United States will commit to, how significant a player it is, and Donald Trump, president-elect's past form when it comes to climate.
Well, I mean, the United States is the biggest economy on the planet. It's the second biggest emitter on the planet. It would be ridiculous to pretend that it's not important in the context of global summits on climate change. But the fact is that last time around, when Donald Trump was in office, he did his best to disrupt international negotiations. He did his best to stop the clean energy transition, and he failed on both counts. There's actually twice as much renewable electricity capacity installed in the world since when he left office. Obviously, the Biden administration has committed billions to investing in clean energy in the US. That's grown jobs. It's seen investment going into some of the poorest parts of the United States. And the big news about that investment is that 85% of it has gone into Republican areas. So it seems reasonably unlikely, A, that Donald Trump will be able to persuade the rest of the Republican Party that they ought to ditch that investment and lose those jobs, but also that he will succeed the second time in trying to stop the international process, because actually the momentum towards clean transition has only built up in the world since then, with the massive investment we're seeing in renewables.
I was hearing some optimism surrounding Donald Trump's potential policy in terms of, yes, he is in charge of kind of what happens, or will be in charge of what happens in terms of policy for the United States, but it may not necessarily be so negative when it comes to influencing the rest of the world.
Well, exactly, and not least because large parts of the United States will carry on regardless of what he tries to do at the federal level. That's exactly what happened last time. We saw massive states like California and New York, big companies, universities, individuals, like a huge swathe of the United States basically heard him say, we're leaving the Paris Agreement, and they stood up and shouted, well, we're still in, because we still want to do this. We think this is important. We see extreme heat hitting large parts of the United States, devastating wildfires. We saw those appalling hurricanes hitting Trump's his home state of Florida, certainly where he lives the loss of his time. All of those impacts, they will carry on regardless of what the federal government does. And actually, I think at state level and company level and citizen level, the United States will carry on doing that climate action, which is so necessary to limit those worsening climate impacts, just as they did last time around.
What do you think the impact is of the UK when it comes to this discussion? You used the word major player, but we're a small country.
We're a major economy. We're a major economy, though. We are one of the 7 biggest economies on the planet. We are one of the top three or four, I think, biggest historical emitters, we went early in terms of investing in renewables. We started to grow the industry in the UK before many other countries were. So we had a competitive advantage. We grew the jobs. We helped bring the cost of those technologies down globally so that we could invest in more of them, so that the other countries in the world could invest in more of them. We were the biggest single part of the offshore wind industry in the world for quite a long time as a result of that. So, and on the back of all that, when the UK then came to international negotiations, like in Paris, when the Paris Agreement was brought into place, you know, the UK then has the authority of a country, a major economy that is walking the walk, not just talking the talk, and they can help bring others along with them, and it helps build that momentum. So, in all those ways, the UK is a major player when it chooses to be, and when it chooses to do do the right thing, and then come to global talk about doing the right thing and persuade others to do the right thing.
I always think it's worth, when we cover events like this, and I will just say we are waiting for Sir Keir Starmer to come up to the podium. I have an eye on the stage, so if I interrupt, Gareth, please forgive me.
Understood.
I always think it's worth knowing new kind of phrases that you can throw around when you're having a coffee or whatever and discussing this. NDCs, explain what they are.
In short, that's the emissions pledge that
Nationally determined contributions.
It's a nationally determined contribution under the Paris Agreement, and it contains lots of things like plans for how a country is going to adapt to worsening climate impacts, how wealthy countries particularly, are going to contribute to help poorer countries to develop sustainably and to adapt to impacts as well. But the sort of the headline point in an NDC is by how much is this country going to cut its emissions by the next relevant date. So at the moment, the UK is committed to is at least 68% emissions reductions by 2030, and then we will hear from Sir Keir Starmer what the UK is committing to for 2035, which we would expect the number to be a fair bit higher. They asked for advice recently from the Climate Change Committee. They advised that the target should be 81% by 2035. So that's what the NDC is. It's at its highest level, at its biggest impact level, it's the country's emissions pledge, by how much it's going to cut emissions.
Tell me, I don't know how hot you are on economics of the UK, but we are all being told that there's no money, that there's a huge black hole to fill by this Labour government. Why does this Labour government feel it can commit to even more money to climate change?
Well, it's a choice between committing to the transition to cheaper, clean, renewable energy, or building in much higher costs into the future, because a lot of the energy costs rises that we've seen over the last couple of years, a lot of the other inflationary pressures in the UK, they have been as a result of the very volatile price of gas on global markets. So the longer we are reliant on gas, the more our energy system costs us into the future. So this is actually what the government is committing to in rapid transition away from fossil fuels is the cheaper option in the medium to longer term, even the short term in some senses, in terms of the sooner we can cut emissions, the sooner globally we can limit the temperature rises, the less we are bashed about by worsening extreme weather as a result of climate change. So what's being committed to here is the cheaper option in the medium to longer term.
It's that whole. I suppose it's a reflection on invest now for growth in the future.
And a lot of that investment, of course, comes from private companies. You know, there are private companies. The EU and the US have been competing over the last 4 years to attract that investment by providing incentives and tax cuts. You know, not necessarily lots of additional public funding, but lots of incentives that draw the investment. The UK has been doing the same for a long time. And, you know, the UK has the opportunity to compete in that market, attract that investment, which grows our economy and puts us in a much stronger position then to be able to afford the investment that this government has said that it wants to put into public services, for example.
I've had a text talking about the elephant in the room. Someone says the elephant in the room is not Donald Trump, but the no reporting on the need of the single biggest thing that an individual can do right now. According to Oxford University's EPIC study, the largest to date of this kind, go vegan. How is this translating into our everyday lives and our everyday?
I mean, one of the biggest impacts that an individual has in terms of our individual choices is how we eat. Our food system is very emissions intensive. Meat is the most emissions intensive. So even as people just choose to eat less meat, just choose to eat meat on fewer days of a week, we have a big impact in terms of reducing the emissions in the food system. We don't all need to go vegan to be able to reduce that impact. And in fact, we've seen over the last few years people making that shift. There's been a growth in, people buying those plant-based foods. You see more of them in the supermarkets now, alongside steaks and hamburgers and whatnot. So I think people's behaviour is gradually changing, not least because a lot of the food's quite nice. A lot of it is, eating more plants is healthier for you than eating lots of meat as well. So people make food choices for lots of reasons, but yeah, if we all choose to eat less meat, we will help reduce that pressure on the climate.
I'm a big fan of a butterbean and a chickpea, I must say. Dave in Horsham's message saying, we need to be following Trump's lead and scrapping the net zero nonsense before we totally destroy our economy in the ridiculous hope of knocking maybe 0.005 of a degree off in 100 years. There are no new jobs. They are simply replacing old jobs in the fossil fuel industry. What would you say to Dave?
I would say that there are actually huge opportunities for us if the US pulls back on climate to grow our economy from investing in this. This is not an expensive thing to commit to going to net zero. There are hundreds of thousands of green jobs in the UK. The net zero industries in the UK contribute £74 billion a year to our economy. So they're already a huge part of our economy. The more we grow them, the more we are growing part of the economy that is there for the long run. Fossil fuels are not there for the long run. We cannot sustain this degree of temperature rises. We're not talking the tiny percentage that he just described. We're currently on track for between 2.6 and 3.1 degrees rise in temperatures this century, and they've already risen by 1.5 degrees over the last 150 years. And they're going so that rise is getting faster and faster, and we can see the damage that it's doing in terms of extreme heat, which is affecting food crops around the world. One of the reasons why our food is getting more expensive in the UK is because of climate impacts in other parts of the world. We import about 2/5 of our food, and about climate impacts over the last couple of years have put about £360 on the average UK food household bill. So climate change is adding to our costs. Transitioning to net zero will reduce our costs, and it grows our economy and creates jobs.
It's interesting where these COPs are held, isn't it? Just in themselves. In Azerbaijan, a petrostate, as it's described. Yeah. Deliberate. What's the message that people should take from that?
It rotates. It's just a UN process. It rotates between groups of countries.
I know, but it goes to whether or not. But it goes to whether or not they mean it, doesn't it? Or if they call states out.
Absolutely, and as I get the bus through a literal oil field on the outskirts of Baku to come into the COP in the morning, that is very stark. But in actual practical terms, last year, when it was being decided where it would be hosted this year, Russia, who is in the relevant group, vetoed any member of the European Union hosting it. So geopolitics are at play in terms of where it's hosted. And if the world just said, OK, well, thanks very much, Azerbaijan, but we don't want you to host it, then, it would end up sort of being forced into Germany, because the UNFCCC's headquarters is in